Back in the mid-90s, my brother started college as your typical sports-loving, girl-chasing dude bro. He didn't care about politics, he wasn't into drugs, and all he cared about was football, partying, and maybe getting himself a degree in business management at the end of it. But then, right at the end of his junior year, he met a girl. I remember the summer it happened, because he kind of just dropped off the face of the earth for a while. It later turned out that he was staying with his new girlfriend's stepdad, but he didn't bother to let anyone know. This upset our mom a bunch, which got Dad pissed, and he made it a whole thing when my brother finally did get home because apparently he was acting weird and withdrawn and all this sort of stuff. This signaled a big change for him, and by his senior year, my brother was almost the polar opposite of his freshman self. He was super into politics, he called himself a psychonaut, and he never ever left the side of his new girlfriend, who held a share of the blame for his total personality shift. The next thing we know, my brother dropped out of college just 2 months before graduation. He said he didn't want some dumb piece of paper and that, this is the line that freaked my mom out, he, quote, wouldn't need it where he was going. Mom asked what this place was, but my brother refused to say. Then after a little more yelling from Dad, he hung up. That was the last we'd see or hear from my brother for almost a whole year. Then, right when we started to think that we might never see him again, who shows up to darken our door but my long-lost big brother? It was a happy time. It was amazing to have him home, but it was a sad time too because he returned a completely broken person. He'd lost a ton of weight, looked like he'd aged 10 years, and he was totally burned out. It was honestly pretty scary to see. But then, where had he been all that time? And what had he been up to? I was kept in the dark on that for the longest time. Mom and Dad just said that he'd been through a rough time up in Oregon and that he just needed time to recover. I was almost 20, old enough to know better than to go asking any sensitive questions, but I was still curious. It took him a few months before he finally told me what happened. There had been hints here and there, but I never heard the full story, not until I caught him with a cold one out on the porch one night, way after Mom and Dad had gone to bed. One of their rules was if he was going to live in their house again, he was going to be clean, but after a few months, he finally broke and decided to enjoy a few quiet brewskis all on his lonesome. He told me that he'd give me one if I kept quiet. Then the more of the beer I drank, the less and less inhibited I became regarding certain burning questions. Then finally, right as I'm about halfway through my second can, I finally asked him what happened in Oregon, and after collecting his thoughts for a moment, he started his story. Right around the holidays during his senior year, my brother and his girlfriend, who we'll just call Mia, heard about this community living project up in rural Oregon. They called themselves the Yochuko Co-op, and with the new millennium approaching, they were going to lead the way in terms of ethical and sustainable living. They made arts and crafts which they then sold at little markets in the city, allowing them to buy whatever they couldn't forage, hunt, or make themselves. But aside from that, there was no money, no personal possessions. It was total communal living. And my brother and his girlfriend wanted to be a part of it. They were originally going to wait until they graduated before traveling up there, but after getting in touch with someone based in the co-op, they were told it was basically now or never. 1999 was right around the corner, and it meant that the co-op was about to go into overdrive in terms of their mission statement. Recruitment was up, productivity was up, and if my brother and his girlfriend didn't make it up there by late spring, there was a chance that there'd be no space for them. This really sold it for them, the idea of a well-organized and well-led community, and that's what made them think that it could be a place that they could really start a life for themselves. But boy, were they wrong about that. When my brother called to tell our parents that he was dropping out of school, he actually intended to tell them where he was going. He never wanted to make anyone mad or disappoint anyone, but when my dad reacted badly to the whole dropping out thing, he basically thought, screw you, and didn't tell them where he was going. And this is also what stopped him from getting in touch with us when things started to go bad at the co-op. He didn't think Mom or Dad wanted to hear from him, I guess partly out of pride too, and the regret of not reaching out was still something that really guilt-tripped him, even many years later. And so off they went up to Oregon, with this real attitude of, this is our life now, and we're never going back. So they get to Portland, where they meet the contact who had been recruiting them. Then after a brief orientation, they're driven out to a forest encampment in the middle of freaking nowhere, where they find a bunch of people living almost totally off the grid. All the money they earn went to medicines and everything else they got from gardening, foraging, or hunting. No one wanted for anything, because someone else would just share their own, and honestly, from the way he described his first few months of living there, it didn't sound all that bad. The group had like 3 different leaders, as well as a council, so there was no single messiah that anyone followed, like a Manson or whatever. There wasn't any immediate red flags, is what I'm trying to say, and far from it actually. It seemed like a really cool place at first. But then, a few months in, things started to get weird. So the closer it got to the turn of the millennium, the more interest the group received from potential recruits. It might sound insane in retrospect, but back then, people were actually really frightened of the turning of the millennium. It was called Y2K, and it was a hugely popular theory back on the internet when it was still kind of in its infancy. The theory went that, and don't quote me on this, but when all the digital clocks went from 1999 to all zeros, computers were going to crash, planes were going to fall out of the sky. You get the idea. It turned out to be a bunch of nonsense, but in the run-up to it, a lot of otherwise very rational people started believing the hype. Then, because of this, recruitment for the group ballooned over a real short of time. Wealthy middle-aged professionals were having nervous breakdowns, giving all their money to the group's council, then just living like wild men in some big tent. The group attracted another type of person too, people with histories of substance abuse, and although the vast majority were good people who needed a different way to live, there were definitely some bad apples in there too. Before the big influx of new people, no one stole, there was no violence, and although there were a lot of pot and mushrooms and stuff, there was never any hard drug use. And that all changed very quickly. Since people were free to come and go as they pleased, certain people would go back into the city, score some drugs, and then just hitch their way back to the co-op so they could eat for free while freebasing or whatever they were doing. They also never did any work, which was a bigger problem than their drug use by a mile. This ended with a bunch of people getting kicked out, but instead of leaving, it turned violent, and the bad apples only backed down at gunpoint. After they left, though, lots of people were scared the bad apples would come back, and they were right to be scared, because they did. And one night, a tent fire sent 2 people to the hospital. Neither were smokers, there were no open flames, and the scorch marks on the forest floor outside suggested the fire had been started outside with some kind of accelerant. It was no accident. It was a deliberate arson attack, possibly by one of the expelled former members. People were really angry. Some wanted to call the cops, others wanted to go after them and deliver some vigilante justice. The co-op's council was equally torn, and they only agreed on one thing, that the local authorities would not be contacted for any purpose whatsoever. It was also decided by a vote of 5 to 2 that there'd be no kind of proactive retaliation, mostly for the same reasons as above. No one wanted to give the cops a reason to show up and break up the party, and in all likelihood, a bunch of skanky junkies weren't exactly running to the boys in blue. It was the council's view that the best course of action would be to post armed guards around the co-op. That way, any interlopers, as you might call them, could be kept at bay without risking the overall security of the co-op by giving away its position. You gotta keep in mind that these people were not supposed to be out there, just living out in the middle of the woods, and the co-op had grown so much that no one wanted to have to give it up. Safety and security was absolutely paramount, and nothing else mattered. To cover the whole perimeter of the camp, almost all of the guns and all the experienced hunters needed to be shifted from actual hunting to co-op security. That meant that less food was coming into the co-op, which meant people got hungrier and hungrier, and in the end, people began to steal from each other. Then, when people began to steal from each other, violence increased by 100-fold in a terrifyingly short period of time. People got beat up. One guy got his nose broken, and some other girl was stabbed with a little gardening fork. Meds started going missing too, all kinds of stuff, but mainly pain pills, and it meant that a whole bunch of hungry, anxious people got even more fearful and frightened. And then, just when things seemed that they were just getting better, a girl that we'll call Amber, went missing. My brother said that she left all of her stuff behind, just disappeared one night and was never seen again. Naturally, people were worried. People had already started leaving, but no one ever just left all their stuff behind like that, so obviously people were starting to really worry for her. Days went by. People went looking for her, and that's when they found one of the guys they expelled living out there on his own, living off food that had quite clearly come from the co-op's stores. I asked my brother how they knew this, and he said it was because of the brand. Either he'd gotten it from the stores or he'd gotten it from friggin' North Carolina or something. It was something that you didn't see out west much, let's just put it that way. But then the thing that got people really mad, as in incredibly livid, was the fact that the guy had a piece of the missing girl's clothing in his possession. My brother said it was never really clear what it was or how he'd come into possession of it, but that the rumors were pretty gnarly. Some suggested he killed her, then took the clothing as a trophy, and as much as the guy denied it, no one seemed to believe him. The people that found him tried to bring it back to the co-op, but in the struggle, the guy pulled a knife and then stabbed one of them. They had to beat the hell out of this guy just to subdue him, and the wounded man was taken to the hospital on the promise that he'd never tell a soul where the co-op was or who stabbed him. And that last part became real important. My brother said a select few from the co-op's security team started questioning the guy, asking him where the missing girl was and why he had her clothing. It was sold on the co-op as an investigation, but they knew it was torture. They knew because they could hear him screaming through the trees. The team had tried to take him as far away from the co-op as they could, but on a quiet, dreary day, they could still hear his faint cries for mercy as the security team worked him over. As brutal as it sounds, a lot of the co-op just didn't care. Even if the guy had nothing to do with Amber's disappearance, there was a chance that he was involved in the arson attack, something the co-op still wanted payback for. Even some of the more civilized of the co-op members didn't condemn what was happening. They were that worn down from weeks of deprivation. If someone needed to get hurt to keep the co-op safe, then so be it. Then came the morning when everyone was roused from their tents or shelters, then summoned to what served as the co-op's town square. There was the prisoner, tied to a tree, beaten to a bloody pulp, but still alive. One of the co-op's leaders, and apparently by far the most hawkish of the bunch, told the gathered crowd that the guy had confessed to killing Amber, but was refusing to say what he'd done with the body. It was pretty obvious the guy would have told them anything they asked him to, just to get the torture to stop. Then, right there in front of everyone, the council member announced that Amber's killer had been sentenced to death, and that his execution would serve as a warning to those both inside and outside the colony. My brother said it was almost impossible to believe, that there was a part of him that thought it would be like a mock execution. He joined the co-op because the leadership comprised of some of the kindest, gentlest folks around, but here they were, just less than a year in, and the experience had almost completely transformed them. My brother never, ever believed that they were capable of something so horrifying. Only, they were. And after the 3-man firing squad took up position, aimed, and fired, the prisoner went limp before his clothes started soaking up the blood pouring from his chest. My brother wasn't the only one who thought the whole thing was just some kind of brutal theater. Screams came up from the crowd when the shots rang out, and some started to weep when they realized just how far the co-op had fallen. After that, people started leaving in the middle of the night, just packing up their stuff and disappearing in way bigger numbers than they had before. It got to the point where certain co-op members were being told that they were core members, which was code for, "You're not allowed to leave." Luckily, my brother and his girlfriend weren't on the list, but they still departed under the ruse that they were headed into town to pick up some medicine. To make it look more believable, they all left their stuff behind, all of it. Then they walked to a nearby highway, then went to stay with some old friends over in Portland. A few weeks go by, all is quiet, so my brother's girlfriend figured that they might be able to go back to retrieve some of their stuff if it hadn't already been appropriated by the rest of the co-op. He calls her crazy, refuses to go, and begs her not to either. Like I just said, there was basically zero chance of her getting any of her stuff back, even the stuff with sentimental value, but she insisted on going alone, even in spite of all my brother's warnings. He figured that they'd either hurt her or somehow convince her to stay, so when she didn't arrive back in Portland when she said she would, he started to worry. Then at some point the next day, he sees a news report about a forest fire and how firefighters had found 3 or 4 charred bodies out near what appeared to be some kind of ad hoc camping spot. The whole co-op, or whatever had been left of it, had been caught up in a forest fire, either deliberate or natural, and either Mia, my brother's girlfriend, had gotten caught up on it, or she decided to just duck out on him and break off a long-term relationship like she was a deadbeat dad stepping out to pick up some smokes. The people my brother had been staying with weren't exactly his friends, so he wasn't welcome there much longer after Mia didn't come back. And that's when he threw in the towel and made his way back to California, totally wiped. I guess for a lot of people, my brother's story makes for one of the craziest they'd ever heard, and I've had some people question whether or not it actually happened. We didn't see any pictures of the co-op, we didn't meet Mia, and I admit that no one actually knows where he was or what he was doing for that year my brother was missing. But I believe he was living off the grid, and I believe he saw some heavy stuff up there too. Because even after all this time, even after all the improvement he's made, he's still not quite the same guy that left for Oregon all those years ago. I know that no man our age is as full of life as they used to be, but if you'd seen my brother on the day he started college versus the day he came home from Oregon, you'd have seen it in his eyes. He'd been through hell, and it had taken something from him. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.